Beautiful. Hello, welcome everybody. We have folks trickling in. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be talking with you all today. And we will probably get started in a couple minutes. Just want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to come in and get connected to the sound. I'd like to mention today too, this session is going to be in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. The interpretation rooms aren't open yet, but when they do open up, you'll be able to mouse down to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon to choose the language you'd like to listen to the rest of the meeting in. And we'll announce that in all the languages in a couple minutes when we're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm just seeing it. I know I'm seeing my.
Oh, hello.
Yep.
We may have someone who joined with a panelist link by mistake. If that is the case, you may want to mute just because we're recording this session and we'll be starting in a couple minutes. But we are really excited again to have you all here. We are recording this session so we can post it later for those who may want to hear the information but weren't able to join today or on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. when we're hosting the same session again, but in the evening for folks who can't make it during the day. And we'll probably give it like 1 to 2 minutes more before we start up. Again, just giving everyone the opportunity to come in and get their audio connected. All right, so we are going to start up and get going. Thank you all for joining us today and taking the time to be here. We are really excited to have you. Before we get going and I pass it over to Teresa and the wonderful team at the Children Investments Fund, I'd just like to say welcome and to let you know that this session is going to be recorded so we can post it later for those who missed today. And it's also going to be in 3 languages. So in the main room, you'll hear English, but we also have amazing interpreters who are going to be providing simultaneous translation into Spanish and Portuguese. And you can access that in a moment after our interpreters introduce themselves by mousing to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a little globe that says interpretation, and you'll be able to click on that and enter the room to hear in your language. So I'll pass it over to our Spanish interpreter.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Katia, voy a ser la intérprete de español esta mañana y José se va a unir luego. Bienvenidos, estamos muy emocionados de que estén aquí con nosotros. Gracias por tomar el tiempo esta mañana para estar aquí. Y antes de pasar a comenzar este webinario con Teresa del Child Investment Fund, le queremos dar la bienvenida, dejarle saber que esta sesión se va a estar grabando y va a estar disponible luego en 3 idiomas. El día de hoy van a escuchar en el idioma inglés en la sala principal. Luego en un momento van a ver un globo que se va a estar poniendo en la parte de abajo y en ese globito ustedes van a poder seleccionar si quieren español, portugués o simplemente escuchar en inglés. Pero todavía no está puesto, en un momentito se lo van a poner. Ahora va a pasar la intérprete de portugués.
Hello, good morning. This is Anilda, and I'll be your Portuguese interpreter. Alô, sim, muito bom dia. Meu nome é Zenilda, serei vossa intérprete de português durante esta sessão. Novamente, nós damos as boas-vindas a todas as pessoas que estão aqui conosco. Muito obrigado por se juntarem a esta sessão e por tirarem do vosso tempo para estarem aqui conosco. Estamos muito animados com a vossa colaboração. Portanto, damos novamente as boas-vindas, avisamos que essa sessão será gravada e iremos oferecer interpretação simultânea para duas línguas, que será português e espanhol, e no canal principal poderão escutar a sessão em inglês. Assim que os canais estiverem ativados, poderão visualizar um ícone globo no fundo da tela e poderão selecionar qual língua que gostariam de escutar a sessão. Portanto, que será inglês, espanhol ou português. Obrigada, thank you.
Thank you so much. I am opening the interpretation rooms now. Beautiful. So you should be able to choose your language again at the bottom of your screen if you click the globe. And I will pass it over to Teresa to start us out. And again, thank you for being here.
Great, thanks, Eugenia. And good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is the EEOST Capital Fund Information Session for the large grant round. We're excited to be back co-administering this round with EEC. The last large grant round was operated in fiscal 2020, right before COVID. So we're excited to be back doing this round. So thank you for taking the time to participate in this session, this information session with us. My name is Teresa Jordan, and I am the director of the Children's Investment Fund. So just a few logistics before we get started. All attendees are on mute. The chat function is disabled because we will be using the Q&A function instead. So please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. We may address some of your questions during the webinar, during the presentation, but you can certainly please type in any questions that you have in the Q&A as we go along, and we will have time at the end for a live Q&A session. We're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period. We are recording this webinar, and the slides will be shared with all of you that registered, and will also be posted on Combise along with the application documents. So where you found the documents for this session is where this recording will live. And we'd also like to note that these grants are for center-based nonprofit organizations only. We saw that some family childcare providers had registered for this information session, and we just wanted to let you know as soon as possible that family childcare providers are not eligible for this funding, unfortunately. But however, you're welcome to stay on if you'd like. EEC will notify family childcare providers when funding is available. And if you signed up for this session, then EEC has your contact information on hand already. But what we will do is drop the link in the chat to all of EEC's offerings for capital grants. But we're excited and hoping, soon that family childcare providers will have access to capital grant dollars as well. So that is what EEC is working hard on. So for this large grant round, the grants offered ranged between $500,000 to $1 million. I should note also that we are offering a separate grant round for nonprofit and for-profit center-based organizations. Those documents were posted back in November on Combise. The applications are due January 23rd, and those grants for the small grants range between $200,000 and $500,000. And that link is a part of the link that was just put in the chat. Okay, next slide, please. So for this session, there are two sessions, as Eugenia mentioned, today and then again on Thursday at 6:30. What we'll do today is to walk through the eligibility, discuss things that changed since the last time we actually operated this round in fiscal 2020. We'll walk through the pre-application and the application helping folks to understand the two different stages. And then again, we'll have time for the Q&A at the end. Presenting with me today are Jose Mendez from EEC and Bree Horwitz from the Children's Investment Fund. And I will now turn it over to Jose.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jose Mendez. I'm the Director of Child Care Business Operations and Facilities. If you have the next slide, please. So the EEOST, or Early Education Out of School Time Capital Fund, was created by an act financing the reduction and preservation of housing for low and moderate income residents. For this particular round, we're going to have $4 million available. And as was mentioned before, we're also going to be doing, excuse me, 2 separate rounds for smaller grant opportunities for nonprofit and for-profit childcare centers. Next slide, please. The EEC has designated the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, or CEDAC, to administer the EEOST program. The Children's Investment Fund, which is affiliated with CEDAC, provides technical assistance and financing to ECE and OST facilities across Massachusetts. Since the first round in FY 14-15, the state has invested $51 million in 110 projects across the state. And again, as I mentioned, this year we're running 2 rounds, one for small grants and one for large grants. Next slide, please. So we're going to be going over the, all of these items can be found in the program guidelines, which include the eligibility requirements, grant terms, underwriting standards, pre-application and application process, and regulations and definitions. Next slide, please. So eligible facilities, as outlined in the guidelines, if a building or structure or site is leased, then the lease facilities should have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but won't be any less than 15 years. This is an important point to remember. If a building, structure, or site is or will be municipally owned, building that dedicates a single purpose space for licensed early education or out of school time programs, then the lease will need to be at a minimum of 25 years. Also, eligible organizations will need to serve at least 50% low-income families as of the date of the EEOST application. Next slide, please. Some eligible uses of EEOST funds are the acquisition of real property, the construction, repair, or rehabilitation, or renovation of an eligible facility, some of the soft costs directly related to the development of that facility. And as outlined in the guidelines, projects that will be 100% complete during the review period of the EEOST large grant program application round will not be considered for funding. This is defined as projects that will be completed at any point between the time of the pre-application until award announcements. If the EEOST project under consideration is part of a larger phase development or multi-purpose development, the EEOST component of the project should not be complete as described in the previous timeline. Next slide, please. So as far as eligible applicants, previous slide. Eligible applicants, the license will need to be in good standing from EEC at the time of the pre-application. Again, organizations will need to serve at least 50% low-income families as of the date of the EEOST pre-application. And this will be further defined later in the presentation. The organization needs to be a non-for-profit, organized under MGL 180, and exempt from federal income tax under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. None of the members or shareholders, the officers, employees, or members of the board of directors can profit in any way from EEOST capital fund assistance. And the applicant doesn't need to be the owner of the property, so long as the applicant can demonstrate site control for a period of at least equal to the term of the applicable EEOST grant. There will be a land use restriction for the term of the grant, though. Next slide. Excuse me. As far as partnerships go, a for-profit may act in joint venture with a nonprofit developer. The nonprofit partner is required to have at least 51% controlling interest in the joint venture. Organizational documents of the for-profit must be provided, along with a description of the nonprofit's controlling interest and the nonprofit's organizational documents as well. None of the members of the partnership, either for-profit or nonprofit, can benefit in any way from EOST funding. Next slide, please. So as far as the land use restriction and mortgage, the grant agreement will include language regarding a land use restriction that ensures the continued use of the property for large group and or school-age childcare for a specific term. These terms are outlined on the slide below, based on the type of arrangement that the property is under. The restriction can be released under a few conditions, whether it's the completion of the grant term, if the project were foreclosed on by a mortgage holder or a bona fide first mortgage with EEC's consent, or in the event of a grant recapture. Next slide, please. So grant recapture provisions, basically it comes down to if the regulations or policies are not being followed, or the terms and provisions of the grant documents are not being followed, then EEC reserves the right to recapture repayment. The grantee will have 90 days to rectify any issues that might arise, and as long as it's acceptable to the EEC. Next slide, please. So if the eligible project facility is found to be in non-compliance with any EEC regulation or policy, the terms and provisions of the EEC grant documents, or with any other federal, state, or local laws, regulations, ordinances, or policies, again, the grantee will have 90 days to rectify those matters that is suitable to the EEC prior to recapture of the funds. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand over to Teresa.
Great, thanks, Jose. Okay, so the guidelines for prior EEOST recipients. So as I mentioned, we have not offered this round for large grants since 2020. So there are some requirements, guidelines that we have for this year. So if you received a grant between fiscal 2014 and fiscal 2020, and those were grants that were up to $1 million, then your organization would not be eligible to apply for this grant round for the exact same site. Okay, so if you had a site in Boston on A Street and you received $1 million grant in fiscal 2017, then you cannot apply this round for that same site on A Street. And then organizations that received an EEOST grant for the same site in fiscal years 2021, 22, and 23, and those were grants that we offered between $100,000 and $500,000, you are eligible to apply for the same site through this large grant round. And then lastly, you cannot apply to the small and large grant rounds for the same site, right? So you cannot submit an application on January 23rd for the project in Boston on A Street, and then submit an application on February 1st for the project on A Street in Boston. So it has to be one grant program or the other. If you have any questions about that at all, we ask that you email us, because we can look it up to see exactly what grant year you received an award, if you received an award from us over the last 10 years. And so we can look that up. So there is an email address at the end that you can submit that question, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible, because we want you to submit an application to the appropriate grant source that you're looking for. Great. Next slide, please. So the maximum grant amount that you can apply for is up to $1 million. The total development cost of your project has to be at least $500,000. It's really important to describe the sources of funding that are necessary for your project. And the reason being is that EEOST cannot fund 100% of the project costs. So if the total development cost of your project is $1 million, then you must show that there is another source that will pay for a portion of that $1 million. All funding must be in place at the time of the full application, and the full application is due on May 2nd, and that is if you are invited to apply. So you're submitting an application on February 1st. That's the pre-application. We will do our review, and then EEC will, invite organizations to apply to submit a full application on May 2nd. And at that time, May 2nd is when you will need to, in that application, demonstrate or show us how the project will be funded. So all of your funding needs to be in hand at that time. And so projects that are 100% complete at the time of the pre-application. So if you have already started construction, your project is done, and you were planning to apply to EEOST for reimbursement, you would not be eligible to apply. If you are phasing your project and the non-EEOST portion of the project is complete, so if your project was affordable housing and childcare and the affordable housing is done, we ask that you show details of what has been done, when it was completed, and provide copies of invoices for the work that was completed. Next slide, please. So in terms of project requirements, we determine ready projects, right? Projects that are ready to move forward as those that have the ability to raise all the funding that's needed, that have nearly finalized their plans and specifications for the project, that have site control, whether you own or lease, and that have a credible plan to achieve financial feasibility, right? So that's all the financing that's needed, whether it's fundraising, a loan from a bank, your own equity, that you have, a feasible financial plan. And whether you have you're able to meet the regulatory feasibility, such as if you need zoning approval and that you've already received that, or you're on your way to receiving that you can meet building code issues, things of that nature. And then also ready projects are those that can be completed with construction within 2 years of an award. So applications are due February 1st, and the pre-application, if you're invited to apply, that full application is due May 2nd. We are hopeful that awards will be announced in September of 2024 of this year. And so there will be a 2-year period of time where construction will need to be complete, and that is, slated for September of 2026. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so we disperse funds, the EEOST funds, after the full financial closing has happened. And a full financial closing and construction start should occur 9 months after an award. So I mentioned that we hope that awards will be announced in September of 2024 of this year. And then organizations that receive an award letter will have 9 months to fully close on their projects with an attorney and start construction at that time. So we're looking at June of 2025 as that construction start period, give or take a month. So the closing will require attorneys and the costs for your attorney as the organization and the EEOST attorney can be included in your project budget. We are seeing and have estimated costs for the EEOST attorney to close on these projects at about $5,000. So that's the amount that you should carry in your project budget. EEOST also requires a construction manager to monitor the construction, and that is an expense that the EEOST program will pay for as well. Again, EEOST will be dispersed on a reimbursement basis, and any pre-development expenses that you've incurred since February 1st of 2023, so of last year. If you have any expenses such as architectural expenses, if you hired an architect that has taken you from the conceptual design stage to final construction drawings, but you have all those expenses that have been incurred, you can include those expenses as of February 1st of 2023 in your project budget to be reimbursed. If you acquired the property, if you purchased a building or land in which to build on, you can include those expenses in your project budget. And those expenses would be as of February 1st of 2022. So we are recognizing that, you know, in terms of acquiring property, if it was 2 years ago prior to the pre-application, then we can acknowledge those expenses in your project budget. Okay, and I will now turn it over to Bree.
Thank you, Teresa. Next slide, please. So these are large, complex projects, and you will likely need the input from many professionals, external professionals outside your organization. All projects are anticipated to have a team assembled and have been working on the project at least 3 months prior to the pre-application date. These professionals that you hire could include an architect to ensure the building that you propose to, the renovations you propose to build, have compliance with accessibility and other codes. You might hire a landscape architect to design an outdoor play space, a range of different engineers to assess mechanical engineering, ventilation, site engineering for the property, and a real estate attorney if you are exploring zoning or other permitting changes. You do not need to have a real estate attorney to close the project on board with your team at the time of the application, but you will need one to handle the closing for your organization if you are granted the funds. So as I mentioned, these team members will be engaged in your project and will participate in the in-person site visits should your organization be selected to submit a full application. Next slide, please. As Teresa mentioned, the construction project manager is a key part of your project. So you will need to have somebody on your team to manage the construction aspects of the project, the timeline, the costs, hiring, and managing the different subcontractors within the project. This person will, or firm, will ensure that the project is built according to the plans and specifications, and that the project that you are proposing is high quality. Considering that the grants are up to $1 million, we strongly encourage you to look to replace rather than repair issues. You know, if you've been dealing with a leaky roof, we suggest you look at the cost to replace the entire roof and do high quality improvements that will serve your organization for many years to come. The construction project manager can be an internal project manager to your organization, say a facilities manager if you have a qualified individual. You just need to ensure that this person is going to be on board with your organization and can interface between the architect and the contractors and serve as the eyes and ears of your organization. Many organizations don't have that person on site, on staff, and so they need to hire an external person to manage those aspects of the project. Next page, please. You know, as I mentioned, the EEOST program is intended to support high quality construction. These are very complicated projects that typically take up to 2 years to build the project. If there is a facilities challenge on your site, this is the time to address it, as I mentioned, and there are many diligence options that you can explore at this time to ensure that what you are proposing will be a permanent improvement for the program. Those include a capital needs assessment to assess the existing challenges within your site assessments that look at water management and drainage issues, and environmental assessments to ensure that there are no hazardous materials or any other conditions on your site that you will need to address as part of this project. So again, these projects are anticipated to adhere to all zoning regulations, accessibility, historic, and these are answers that you'll need to provide as part of the feasibility of the project during the application, the pre-application, the full application, and the site visit, which I will discuss shortly. Next slide, please. So as Teresa mentioned, the project costs all in need to be at least $500,000. The project cost can exceed the $1 million, but the request for EEOST cannot exceed $1 million. There need to be other sources in the project that will fund the project beyond just EEOST. So in other words, if you have $1 million project, you need to show that there are other sources that will be funding the project in addition to your EEOST request. So developer fees and developer overhead are allowed. They just cannot exceed 5% of the total development cost. So a developer overhead will cover the cost of your internal staff members' time. It can reimburse staff time on the project, and the developer fee is allowed within these parameters. In terms of the bids for construction services, so ultimately, if you are awarded the EEOST grant, you will need to show that you have at least 3 bids for all construction services. You do not need those bids in hand at the time of the application, but at the time of the application, you should have an estimate that demonstrates the cost of materials and labor and should be fairly detailed. EEOST as a program does not require prevailing wage or union labor or procurement with regards to that. But there are other issues relating to either your site or your building or sources that may trigger those. For example, if you have a federal interest on your property, as is the case with Head Start, then obviously you need to comply with those procurement options. So these need to be arm's length relationships and transactions. So what that means is that you cannot retain a board member, a family member, somebody close to your organization as a paid consultant for this project. You can have board members volunteer their time as advisors, although we recommend that you hire professionals and pay them through this grant. And as Teresa mentioned, those costs are eligible for reimbursement. If you have any questions about the procurement piece, about the arm's length transaction, feel free to email us and we can explore. In some cases, former board members have consulted on the project as paid consultants, but they are no longer board members. Next page, please. So, unlike the smaller grant round, the general contractor needs to carry payment, performance, and lien bonds for this project. They will need to submit lien waivers with the requisitions for EEOST disbursement. And again, the bid process, if selected, you'll need to demonstrate that you have 3 bids for the general contracting work. We encourage you to look at vendors through the State Supplier Diversity Office. You will get preference points if you do utilize vendors and contractors on that list, but it is not required. Next page, please. So with the application process, as Teresa mentioned, it's a 2-part process. The pre-application will be due February 1st by midnight, submitted electronically. And then organizations will be informed in April if they are invited to submit a full application and will receive those materials at that time. The full application date will be due May 2nd, also at midnight. So there are materials posted on Combis now, but note that the ones for the full application are marked draft only, as they may change before the time of the full application. Please make sure when you submit the pre-application that you have all documents, all attachments, and that you refer to the procurement information to ensure that your organization is eligible to apply. If there are any missing documents, your pre-application may not be eligible to apply. But everything is electronically, submitted this year. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. The timeline for this grant round. So questions that come up today and in Thursday's information session and questions submitted to EEC will be answered and posted on Combise by January 25th. Again, the deadline to submit the pre-application is February 1st at midnight. The review period for the pre-application goes through April, and EEC will reach out to all those who have applied through the pre-application to either invite those projects in with a full application or inform the applicants that their projects will not be invited to apply. The site visits are in-person site visits and will be in May. Please be prepared to have your entire team there to answer questions. It's an opportunity for us to have a tour of your site and talk about various aspects of your project. The review team from EEOST will include a project manager, a construction reviewer, and a reviewing architect. And we'll have about 2 hours. It's an opportunity for you to share any updates since the time of the application, new budgets, an update on fundraising and your other sources, if there have been any changes to the plans. But after that time, there's no further conversation between the applicant and the EEOST review team until the conditional commitments are issued. As Teresa mentioned, we are anticipating that will be within September. And then projects will have 9 months following the conditional commitment to meet general conditions and proceed the project to the point where it can close on this EEOST funding and start construction. And then projects will have 2 years to reach completion. Next page, please. So the pre-application is largely a narrative document. You will be submitting attachments with it, including 1 year of audited financials, evidence of site control, your preliminary estimates and plans and other documents. But essentially, you'll have the opportunity to discuss all the various areas of your project's development and where the project stands at that time. It is fully expected that your project may change in the time between your pre-application and if you're invited into the full application, in that you may have raised more money, you may have advanced the design, but ultimately it should be the same project, the same site between the pre-application and the full application. You will need to show, in order to be invited to be, in order for EEC to invite your project in for the full application, you'll need to be able to demonstrate that you have site control. You have a lease in place, you have a deed, you have an option to purchase the property. You'll need to show that you've been working with your team, again, by sharing diligence and other documentation to show that your project is feasible and that you have progressed the project. You'll need to share audits and other evidence of your organization's financial history. And also EEC will review your organization and your project to make sure you're in compliance with their licensing and financial regs at the time of the pre-application. By submitting everything electronically, we recommend that you label your emails as email 1 of 5, 2 of 5, and CC yourselves on it, just to ensure that if there's an issue with the transmission, that you have been CC'd and can show that you have applied. EEC will send out an automated response with your email, just letting you know that they received the application, but it will not confirm whether all the application components are complete. So please double check for both the pre-application and the full application that you have checked off and included everything on those checklists, which are posted on Combise. It is okay for you to use a compression software to submit your document or use a Dropbox because there will be a lot of files and some of them may be large. Next page, please. So the full application, oh, I'm sorry. I think we've covered all of this. Unlike prior years, applicants should scan the cover page with signatures, but everything is electronic. There does not need to be any hard copy of any documents submitted to EEC this year for either the pre-application or the full application. For the pre-application, one more thing is that you should be able to submit one estimate that covers the scope of your project. Or if you're using various contractors, one scope, you should have documentation for each of the various scopes of your project. If your project is part of a larger development or phase development, please also include those budgets about what that larger development or all phases of your project will cost. There are opportunities to submit those additional diligence items within both the pre-app and the full application. Now, the application will be due May 2nd, also at midnight, also an electronic submission. I've already talked about this site visit. And all EEC will announce conditional commitments or inform applicants that their project will not be funded by September. All projects that are not funded will have the opportunity to request a debrief with EEC to talk about the application and how the project was scored. Let's go to the next page where I'll talk about the scoring. So projects are scored individually. They are not compared to other projects, but all projects are scored on this scale that looks at these various components. So accurate presentation and documentation of project costs, that is how well you have submitted, explained what the project is and the backup that you've included. Have you included estimates and budgets, plans that describe what you're doing? Have you fully described whom you've hired, and that if you have additional funding in the project, have you included those sources of funding within the application? Readiness and feasibility looks at how likely it is that your project is able to succeed on the various pre-development components, like getting through zoning, getting permissions from various authorities, raising the funds needed for the process for the project, and then being able to close on all financing and start construction within 9 months of the award. So all of that depends on how well you've documented the project and are able to describe the project during the site visits. Organizational and financial stability looks at your organization's financial history. We know that every organization was deeply impacted by the pandemic, so having a deficit is not necessarily an issue, but we want to look at how over time, and the application asks for 3 years of audited financials, as well as year to date, how well over time your organization has looked at various new income streams, and operationally, if your organization has grown or otherwise changed over the past few years, how your organization has weathered that change. So we will ask questions about whether you have an endowment, your operating subsidies, if you're shifting your programs, for example, opening up new classrooms, we will ask you questions about that within the application. The site consideration looks at how well your site is suited for the project that you propose. You know, if you have is there pickup, is there drop off? Are you near public transit? Is there outdoor play space? If you have some site issues like environmental issues, or you have a playground that floods, how well have you documented how you propose to repair that throughout the course of construction? The development team and project manager, again, have you hired the appropriate professional folks to help you complete this project successfully? Do they have experience doing these types of projects? If you have an architect, for example, is the architect familiar with licensing regulations and early education or school age design? If you may have an architect to design the entire building and then a consulting architect familiar with childcare to help advise you on the build out of your design. The social vulnerability index looks at whom your organization already serves, including the census tract where you're located, the mix of affordable slots that you have, and then preferences we'll talk about on the next page. So these preferences, there are 7 preferences that the projects will be awarded additional points, and those are really based on where your organization is located and whom you serve. So projects that are located in central Massachusetts or Cape Cod and the islands will receive an additional point. Facilities that already serve at least 80% of subsidized slots. So again, those are families who receive subsidized slots through EEC or through Head Start, will receive these additional points. Programs that currently serve EEC's priority populations, including homeless children and families in supportive childcare and families with young parents. Projects that address accessibility for individuals with special needs. A location within the gateway city, and in Massachusetts, there are 26 gateway cities in the Commonwealth. You can Google to see if you're located in one. Solicitation of businesses or vendors or contractors that are on that state supplier diversity office. And then finally, organizations that have not been previously awarded an EEOST grant. Next page, please. The next few pages will be, they're screenshots from within the application. So there is an Excel document that contains several spreadsheets that you will need to complete for both the pre-application and the full application. So this is the development budget. These are the construction costs, the hard costs for your project. This is just a snapshot of what it is. You can enter in these various categories, and then the pink will auto calculate. So you can see it jumps. This is much longer than than it appears here, but this is just a subset of it. Next page, please. So the sources and uses budget, again, this includes not only your hard costs, but your cost to acquire the property, engineering, other soft costs to hire professionals. And then on the flip side, the sources that you identify will fund it. So again, EEOST should be entered in here, as well as pending or letter of interest or proposed sources. If you are fundraising, for example, many organizations have a capital campaign that's ongoing. You may have some of the campaign funds in hand, the commitments at hand, and then you plan to bridge the rest. Indicate all of that here, and then there'll be an opportunity in the narrative for you to fully explain how you will bridge any sources of funding that are not anticipated to be in hand by the time you are awarded the funds. So for tax credit projects and other very complex projects, there you may have many sources that come in at the construction phase and then will be taken out at the permanent phase. You can also fill this out. There's one for the project itself, and then if your project is part of a multi-phase approach or a much larger project, you can indicate that on a sources and uses budget for the whole project. There's an opportunity for you to do that within both the pre-application and the application. Next page, please. So the enrollment slot chart. So we're happy to talk about this more, but again, this is where you indicate your license capacity. Number 2 is the current slots that you have filled right now for either EEC subsidies or Head Start subsidies. Number 3 are the discounted slots. So those are slots if you have an internal scholarship fund or you are otherwise subsidizing their families. Their children don't receive a subsidy, but they otherwise have discounted tuition. You would indicate that there. And then the private pay slots in number 4. And so this chart will auto calculate the percentage of slots that you currently are serving that are supported through vouchers. If that number is lower than 50%, we go to the next slide, you'll have an opportunity to describe of the children that you currently have enrolled, how many of them receive any one of these other list of public subsidies. And this is what you will need to fill out only if your organization does not currently serve 50% subsidized slots. So these various sources, you would find out whether your families are receiving these subsidies by doing an anonymous survey of all families and asking them if their families have utilized any of these services at that time, and keep that on file. EEC will never ask to audit specific families or look at their financial data or their tax forms, but we need to know that you are looking at your total enrollment, your total enrolled families right now to see which of them carry this additional subsidy if your project does not currently meet that 50% requirement. And again, we can talk about that further if you have questions. Next slide, please. And so these are the email addresses that you can submit questions to now. So for technical assistance regarding the actual real estate development aspects of your project, you can email the Children's Investment Fund at this address right here. And again, all questions submitted to that email address will be included in the Q&A that EEC will post on Combis. The second set of questions, if you have questions about the specific EEOST application or requirements or eligibility, those questions should go to EEC at that second email address. And with that, I will open it up for additional questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bree. Hi, I'm Kira Wilkie with Children's Investment Fund, and I'll be helping just moderate some of your questions. Please make sure you do add your questions to the Q&A. We do have about 10 minutes, and even if we don't get to your question, the chat and all the questions will be included in the Q&A document that we compile and repost on Combis. So question for Bree, sort of two questions into one. Is an applicant organization required to provide matching funds? How much match is required? And for example, Nancy's asking, for example, if your total project cost is between 500,000 and $1 million, how much would the grant cover?
Great, so there's no, so the matching requirement, there's no dollar-to-dollar match requirement. Just the EEOST cannot be the only source within the project. So we encourage you to, in terms of the EEOST request, look at the total cost of the project, and we encourage you to request EEOST for an amount that you need to make the project complete in terms of the financing. So there is no specific match that you need. The project cost needs to be at least $500,000, and the project cost can far exceed the $1 million, but your EEOST request has to be up to $1 million. Does that make sense?
Great.
Okay.
And Bree, can you say more about the requirement that design teams should be in place 3 months before the February 1st pre-application deadline? So should folks, I guess that's November, ideally have been working with a team?
That's right. So these projects tend to be very complex projects, obviously. So the goal is that your team has been working together for some time, and that by the time the pre-application comes, you can submit plans, and those can be preliminary plans, conceptual plans. They do not need to be construction level plans. You can submit estimates. You will have the preliminary diligence in hand in order to answer questions about your project. You know, for example, if you're looking at updating your HVAC within the building, you will hopefully at the time of the pre-application, and definitely by the time of the full application, have been working with an engineer to assess the ventilation within your building and be able to propose a be able to articulate what it is you need to do within your center to serve the needs of your staff and children. In other words, you know, you should be able to have an estimate that fully talks about replacing certain equipment and looking at the air intake needs, and all of that takes time. You know, obviously this is not an application that you would pull together overnight to submit. So the goal is that you've been working with your team at least 3 months by the time of the pre-application, and then, you know, many months later, when you're invited to submit the full application, you'll be able to answer these questions from our team in terms of, you know, why does this comply with the building code? Why are you doing this? Does this comply with historic requirements? And so forth.
Okay. And I will just add, again, please do reach out to us, anyone, for any, if you want to talk further about your project. We do welcome that. So definitely reach out if you feel like you don't fit something quite right, or if you have more questions. Teresa, will centers that received a small capital grant last year be less competitive in the large grant round because EEC had already made a grant to them the previous year?
No, I don't think, no, not at all. As Bree mentioned, all projects will be scored on a 100-point system. So they'll be scored individually and not compared to other projects. You know, we are really looking at your ability to start construction within 9 months of an award, whether you have all funding in hand. We went through the other scoring areas such as readiness and feasibility, operational and financial stability, whether you have a development team in place. So those are the things that we're looking at to determine, right, as we're scoring your project. The site visit will be very informative. So that's an opportunity for us to have a back and forth with you, with our team of professionals. So again, we'll have a construction monitor there, excuse me, a construction manager, as well as an architect. And if you are doing any HVAC work, so that will give us a chance to just ask questions specifically about your project. But yes, your project should be as competitive as if you had not applied.
Thanks, Teresa. Bree, can construction have already started but not be completed by the time of the award?
Yes. So what this would mean is that if you are starting to do site work, you're starting to work on the project just cannot be completed during the time of the EOST review, which is from the time of the pre-application in February, all the way through when the projects are announced. Now, if this is a multi-phase or complicated project, you know, say it's a housing and childcare project and you've completed the shell of the building, but the childcare piece will be completed later, that qualifies, that's fine. Just explain that within the pre-application and the application in terms of the timeline. The goal is that the feedback that you will receive from the architectural and construction reviewers on the EOST review team can help inform and improve your project. So obviously, if your project is slated to be completed in October or November 2024, that does not present an opportunity for the EOST review team to really impact the design. So if you have specific questions about the timeline of your project, please reach out and we can certainly talk about that.
Okay. And Bree, would the grant cover both an acquisition of a property and renovation to that property?
Yes, it could. So again, as Teresa mentioned, unlike the small grant round, you can utilize the large EOST grants for to reimburse you for acquiring a property, to buy a property. If you do include the acquisition cost within your application, you will need to also include an appraisal or other documentation that demonstrates that you paid an amount that was appropriate for that site. And as Teresa mentioned, those costs can be 2 years prior to the date of the pre-application. All other costs that you're asking for reimbursement must be incurred within 1 year of the pre-app or February 1st, 2023. But you can apply for both acquiring a site and then building out the interior or the playground as the EOST project.
All right. And Teresa, can you talk a little bit more about what we call the land use restriction? So the period of time that this grant covers, and if there are any stipulations that could affect a center later on, for example, any payback penalties if you go under the 50% low income enrollment, and just how that works.
So the land use restriction is really a document that's required to ensure that the property continues as early education or out of school time programming. So that's the purpose of the land use restriction, and it is tied to whether you own the property, so that would be a 25-year term, or you're leasing the property, and that's a 15-year term. In terms of any, the land use restriction will be released at the end of the 25-year or 15-year period. If there is an event such as a foreclosure on that property, the land use restriction allows EEC a seat at the table when you're negotiating with, so that they have an opportunity to chime in on what the issues are at the time of the foreclosure, if that is what happens. We have not actually seen anything like that in our 10 years of operating this program. but it would allow EEC to be involved. And so there's like a 90-day period of time that, you know, that information would need to be submitted to us as in the Children's Investment Fund, because we will be monitoring these projects along the way. So every year after you finish complete construction, we will send a letter to the organization and asking for information so that we are aware and can demonstrate that the program continues to be operational. In terms of any penalties, there are no this is a grant, right? So we understand that the land use restriction and the mortgage are things that are typically required for a loan, but this is a grant. There's no recapture unless a program decides to no longer provide services in that space within that 15-year or 25-year term. Then there would be a recapture period for the grant. But again, we will be involved with your project on an annual basis in terms of getting information and really wanting to have conversations with you well before anything like that occurs. So we would hope that, you know, we'll be in conversation if a foreclosure were to come up and we're able to just, you know, be involved and really understand what the issues are. So hope that answers.
Great, thanks. And it is almost noon. I want to honor everyone's time. We have one more question, but I'm just gonna put in the answer to please email us so we can explain more about there's a question about what might be an inappropriate cost and how appraisals work. So I'll turn over to you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone. We know this is a lot of information. Thank you to our translators, and any other last word, Teresa?
No, thank you, everyone, for listening and participating in this session. If, again, as Kira mentioned, Bree mentioned, if you have any questions at all, we really want to make sure that we're answering your questions as you submit these applications, because there would not be another opportunity if you were to submit to the wrong program, or, you know, just so that we can really help guide and provide some technical assistance. So thank you again for participating, and we hope you have a great afternoon, and we look forward to receiving your applications. Thanks.